Welcome to Vox's Politicast, your number one source for mainstream inside the Beltway conventional wisdom. We're known to get a little bit wonky a bit here, and we go a little bit into the weeds about politics and policy here. So, oh, whoops! Looks like my bow tie just fell off again. No, not really. You're listening to Animation Dissection. I am Nixie, of course, here with Zorak.
Liberty stands for freedom. All hail the flag that set us free. Standing righteous, symbolic of our strength, our hope for freedom to be. My friends, reunite hand in hand. Oh, hail liberty, a bell. I fucked it up, actually, but hey.
I'm pretty impressed you were able to get that far.
I remember the whole lyrics to that. I could probably do it better to music. I can't.
And the melody.
I got to stretch. There's a bit in there where they stretch out things in a natural way, because then they kind of stretch it out for a while in ways that are natural. Then they go, oh, hail, Liberty Bell, true freedom for all men. And that bit,
yeah, it does really get
that
awkward.
part makes sense. There's just this bit in the middle that's just like, what the fuck are you doing? The best part of that song, though, is the final verse of it literally goes, F. That stands for freedom. As well as the flag that stands so strong. It's like, you're not wrong. At the same time, that's a terrible anthem. But go on.
Well, it is a fictional one. So we are today talking about Legend of the Galactic Heroes. But before that, how are you doing, Zorak?
I'm doing all right.
Have you found anything good to watch, anything good to play at the moment? Are we living in a wasteland of culture, or?
We are absolutely living in a wasteland of culture right now. I'm not really following much that's ongoing right now. The only anime stuff I'm following right now are, I'm behind on everything as usual, but the only stuff I'm still watching are Little Witch Academia and the Pokemon anime, which still continues to be very good. And by which I mean just goofy as all hell. Man.
Yeah, something that's genuinely delightful. Let's see, as for me, I am continuing a few series from last time and some things that have started their second season. There's one that I really like called, Shouwa Genroku Rakko Shinju. It's a bit of a long title. It's a good one. It's about a Japanese art form of storytelling, kind of like Japanese stand-up, but from like 300 years ago. So that's a really well done show. Surprisingly good by Studio Dean.
Huh.
Occasionally they could do something really good. Who knew?
I mean, with Studio Dean, like sometimes you just. Like, does it have that Studio Dean quality art style, or is it just...
No, it actually genuinely looks good. Like, I don't know what happened. They must clearly be outsourcing to someone else.
I mean, they used to do okay stuff back in, like, the 80s. It's kind of insulting.
This is basically their only good show that they have done. Other than that, March Comes In Like a Lion is still really good, and I think that one is, what's that studio where they always have people bending their head back in a weird way? What's that name of that damn...
Oh, the studio?
They do...
God.
Yeah.
Shaft?
Yes, and Shaft's doing that one, and that one's really good, so... There's something.
Yeah.
Those are my main two recommendations, other than the ones that you've already mentioned.
Yeah, the season's not great.
No. Even in terms of games at the moment, there's really not much. I mean, I'm going back and playing old SNES games, just rebeat Chrono Trigger and things like that. Just fill in the hole until Persona 5 comes out.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for that new Zelda to come out. That's where I'm at.
Yep. So... in terms of animation news, I really don't have too much other than that Kubo won BAFTAs, a film that has otherwise kind of been overlooked in the U.S. in that regard. I think Zootopia did much better in terms of the U.S. award shows, at least until whatever's going to happen with the Oscars and
it's probably going to
Oscars.
Win it. It's a Disney
Oscars,
film.
Just in general, being bullshit. So who cares?
Yeah.
I have not seen Kubo, so I can't make any judgments on it. But hey, Laika getting recognition is always nice, just because
it would be nice to have, a non-Disney and non-Pixar movie win. Just in principle.
Yeah, they always seem to produce very high-quality films, but they seem to really be struggling on, actually making films that penetrate into a wider audience. And I mean, to a certain degree, I guess that's admirable, because it's good that they're not going, super, Disney is very obvious with almost everything that they produce in terms of, there's elements of it that feel very targeted to the mass market audience, whereas there's something more creatively genuine,
freeing.
Yeah,
the thing is with them is that they don't really have to worry about the profit motive, because even if they're in the red, the owner of the studio is still willing to finance and take risks anyway. So they're kind of like I would say kind of like what those Canadian short films were when they're funded by the Canadian government. You're allowed to kind of just do lots of crazy shit and not really have to worry too much about the consequence.
I mean, though, is that going to last to the point where they're if they're really in the red, or are they just, or it's just?
I don't know. As long as Nike's doing okay, I think.
That's right.
Going to continue existing.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of like it's a passion project, I guess, if you're going to call it that.
Hey.
I mean, and they have really good artistry. I just really have not been impressed with their storytelling in the last few entries. But if you're going to look at technical ability, holy crap. So,
yep.
Other than that, I can't think of any news. I mean, again, we're in this kind of slow period. And to be fair, I think other news is taking priority in my life right now.
Sure.
Speaking of a horrifying situation, Legend of the Galactic Heroes.
Yeah.
So, Zorak, this is one of your favorite series, so I'll have you introduce it for us.
Well, it's not just one of my. I think it's actually just my favorite anime, or probably one of my favorite creative works of all time, to be completely honest. It's based on a novel written by Yoshiki Tanaka between 82 and 87. It's like a series of 10 or so novels, I believe, that ended up getting animated between 1988 and 1997 or I think it's actually 96 or 86 they did a movie, and then 88 through 97 they did a series of OVAs, hundreds of episodes. I think like 112, 111, something like that. It's a lot.
About that much, yes.
110 episodes, yeah. So it was a lot of episodes.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
Not in a bad way, but it is a lot.
Yeah. So I think it was for whatever reason, it was a Kiddie Films. Kiddie Films did a lot of producing for stuff for a while there back in the 80s and early 90s. And it ended up being animated by Artland, who I think still exists. They're not very... I think they did some of the Mushishi stuff. I think, yes, Artland did Mushishi.
Yeah.
So they tend to be attached occasionally to some more artsy stuff now and again, and otherwise they typically just do animation assistance. And then some of the other stuff was animated by Magic Bus, and I have no idea if Magic Bus still exists. I guess apparently it does. Apparently they still do. I just looked it up. They still exist. And then some and like the first 26 episode also had Madhouse helping on it. So that had been early ass.
And it definitely shows, especially with the first movie.
Yes. So in terms of animation quality, it's hard to say that it's like one of the strong suits of Legend of the Galactic Heroes. In fact, it's very weakly animated a lot because they clearly cut a lot of corners.
Well, it's for television and 112 episodes.
I mean,
yes,
it wasn't, though. It was direct-to-video.
Well, but it's animated as if it's made for television.
Sure. Yes.
I mean, just in general, having to animate 112 22-minute episodes, that's like multiple movies just all in a row.
And they also were releasing like a television show's worth per year. Like they were doing like 32 episodes a year, even with their OVA releases. So they were, keeping at a pretty well, pace. It ended up coming up, I believe, originally it was on Laserdisc.
Oh God!
Unfortunately, not all of the originals that they used for the laser discs were preserved. So that's why if you watch the DVD rips that now exist these days, or the Blu-ray rips, you'll notice several sections that are conspicuously very much, that was clearly reanimated more recently, where it's clearly done digitally, whereas the rest of it is not.
Yeah, I noticed that with the line quality and the color just gets really... Yes, very, very digitally, the onset of digital coloring and line work. So
yeah, and
I was wondering about that because it just seemed so arbitrary, and I thought maybe this was a part of the remastering process. So
no, I mean, I think it's a little column A, little column B, where they, generally speaking, they found the bits and scenes and they try to use that. But there was also bits where if you actually watch the portions that were ripped from Laserdisc, there's some stuff in there where just the original animation just was not very good, where the faces were very, very off. Personally, I'd prefer them to have stuck with that and just use the originals in like a lower quality and then just, have the art style look bad in times, but that's not the decision they made for those DVDs, and that's fine. If you want to, you can also seek out the original Laserdisc rips, because that's what people lived off of for decades. Essentially, that's what, when this anime was first subtitled, it was certainly off the Laserdisc. The DVDs only came out last 3 years or something. Blu-ray and DVDs was 3 years ago.
In terms of the West, it's kind of like a cult classic, because I don't remember really hearing about it much until much more recently. I mean,
yeah, the thing is, like, it's been something that definitely a cult classic in the sense that it has been around, being slowly been worked on for ages. I think the main subtitler that worked on it, Central Anime, started in like 1992. So
oh wow,
they've been subtitling this thing for ages, and eventually they got there and did the whole thing. But yes, it's a very niche sort of subject matter, because for those who aren't familiar with Legend of the Galactic Heroes, it's a very Western style space opera. Not so much in the Star Wars kind of space opera where it's high fantasy.
Well, Star Wars is not a space opera; that's a Western.
Yeah, it's a space opera in the sense, when I say space opera, there's two different ways you can look at it. You can look at space opera God, I keep trying to think Zap Brannigan, but that's the stuff that Zap Brannigan character-wise was making fun of. The
Flash Gordon.
Flash Gordon, yes. So, the Flash Gordon style, because those have been called space operas in the classical sense. But typically, when people actually talk about space operas, they think in like the grand space opera in the sense of like, oh, there's ships in space doing war stuff. And in a lot of ways, this Legend of the Galactic Heroes is more just a 18th century naval story told from the perspective of space.
It definitely felt like I was reading like high school literature again, like especially when you get into the European and Russian literature. Like it definitely felt like I was reading like Anna Karenina or War and Peace again. It had that kind of feeling to it, but in space. And it's just an interesting aspect of it in terms of genre, is that you could definitely have taken the technology away and kind of transported it to a different time, and it would work still fairly well.
Sure, and if you wanted to,
but I think there is a point to. I think there definitely is a point to the fact that it takes place in the future, and that it is a little bit of a slap in the face to the utopians out there who think that it's kind of like the anti-Star Trek in the sense that, like, oh well, once humanity is finally able to get into space, we got to have our shit together, and it's like no, we're still going to suck terribly.
Yeah,
and I think it's kind of that message, and I think it's felt now in a lot of ways, in that they kind of directly say things like, people have a mistaken belief that borders and countries and nations are eternal, and that they don't change, and that things don't collapse and all that. And it's like, well, yeah. So it kind of is very interesting in that it speaks to our times right now.
Yeah, and like, speaking to it being such a niche subject matter, is that, like, it's had a very fervent fan base for the longest time. People who do take the time to, get over that hump of like, man, there's so many episodes and wow, this is very dry at times. Most people, when they watch it, learn to kind of love it in the sense that, like, wow, it's nothing, like, no other anime is like this. Nothing else is like this. It doesn't, I almost feel like it doesn't belong. Like, you could have easily have seen this more. It doesn't necessarily have to have been anime, other than, the fact that,
space
costs,
battles.
Yeah, like, maybe the costs associated with that, you could easily have
well, if it looked like 1970 Star Trek, it would be a little bit harder to take seriously.
Sure, and that's
especially live action Japanese television style productions. It it would not really. I don't think it would have aged as well.
Probably not. And, and there's the ipping animation does help with the suspension of disbelief on some of the sillier aspects that happen at times. But, the general idea of it is essentially that...
well, you have Space Germany, and then you have Space America.
Well,
it's not subtle in this regard.
I mean, it's Space Germany and like Space America / Japan / it is kind of a combination of other, parliamentary and, representative governments in the sense. But it's basically just, hey, the far future has happened. You have the galaxy split in twain, or some portion of one of the arms split in twain, where on one half you have the Galactic Federation, or sorry, actually it's not the Galactic Federation, it's just the Empire. And then you also have the Free Planets Alliance, which, as Nixie commented, is a representative government. And basically, throughout these two nations, we're basically following the motion of two
upstarts.
Upstarts would be one way of looking at it. Yeah, they're two political novices and military geniuses who are moving up the ranks. And very different figures taking very different perspectives on governments and, how to approach both life and, war.
Well, governing philosophy, war, humanity. It covers a lot of topics, and I think pretty well. One of the things there's a moment in there that I absolutely had a conniption fit was when there's a character named Andrew Fork, and he proposes this strategy, and one of the lines he says is something like, they'll come out and they'll greet us as liberators. And I was like, this thing was written in the 80s, and that is word for word shit that people said in 2002.
There's a lot of, okay, so that's one of the most interesting things about this. It's that it's an anime set in the far future, but so much of it is like an introspection on war, the nature of governments and politics in general, and just in the human condition that really holds up exceptionally well. And to a certain degree, part of one of the great benefits of it being so long is that it does talk about so much that you can find so much going on that is applicable. There's just so much to mine there, and actually take as being oh, this one little bit here speaks to this one specific thing going on. But it also just there's a lot of very good trenchant insight on that. And
yes,
the fact that it's forward applicable, it really must stem from the fact that the author had a lot of looking back at human history. He must have looked at nations and governments and what happened with them, and as it turns out, for as much as we supposedly advance in society, not all that much actually changes about how humanity thinks and how about governments work. They talk.
Well, the character Yang Wen-li is a historian. I mean, it's pretty much that character is almost kind of like the author, and the entire thing is kind of framed as if it is a documentary in and of itself.
Yeah, it's like some future History Channel look back at the story of this war going on, though that does lead.
But this time the UFOs are real.
Yeah. Oh man. I also real quick pause. How did you feel about the History Channel episodes shoved into the middle of this thing, where they just have...
Oh, the recap episode?
Yeah, but the recap episode where it's literally just...
Oh, but actually of the prehistory of where people legitimately elected fascism.
Yeah, but more in this... yes, that stuff, but also the fact the way it's presented, where they have the little thirds with the names, and it's just them standing in front of bookshelves and
the talking heads. Yeah, it's accurate as
perfect.
Shit. Yes,
it's so perfect.
It is really well done. It feels like it is a show from the History Channel or just one of those talking heads things. It's well observed documentary and style.
Yeah.
Television in that they stylized that episode really well. It was just strange. I mean, they had to come up with these experts and their names and it's just weird to have to fictionalize and come up with that.
Yeah. I mean, and the series as a whole, it's very dry at times. It has little bits of action, but most of the action that does occur is space battles, but
kind of hilarious when it's the interpersonal battles, especially because battle axes have made a comeback, and boy, are they bloody.
But yes, with that stuff, that they do have a little bit of that, but like they try to rationalize that to a degree, and whether or not they succeed.
It makes sense. It's just kind of horrifying when you're actually watching it. You're like, they do not hold back on.
They have a lot of people getting cut in half. Yeah.
Well, they also have people trying to scoop their own insides back into them.
Not commonly. They want like one scene to kind of reflect on, like, by the way, we show a lot of ships going blown up, but let's remember that there's people like dying in these things.
Well, also the numbers of people, the population totals that they talk about
millions
are
of people
absolutely
die per battle.
genocidal.
But it's fine because there's billions of people in
sense.
space. Yeah.
Well, no, I understand. It makes sense. It's just really weird to think about it on our scale because this is the scale that we're familiar with. So it's like, oh yeah, the entire population of Norway just died on this one ship. Oh, okay. That's just
Yeah, and they very consciously do things like that and commentate on that. The two major characters, by the way, are Yang Wenli, who is the idealistic historian who really doesn't want to fight in war and basically tries to minimize the loss of human life on both sides as much as possible. And his whole thing is that he's got a
lowercase Democrat.
Yeah. I'd say so. Lowercase Democrat, very much behind Republican ideals, though he's also very
again lowercase r.
Yes, he's also notably though, like, he's not a idealist in the sense that he thinks that all democracies and republics are great. He's more, I think, the quote I like stealing from him is the sense that like the worst democracy is better than the best dictatorship, in the sense that he's more for the fact that collective ownership of the failure of government is better than the success and failure of government falling into the hands of someone who either seized power or won it by genetic inheritance.
Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense. And I think the series does a really good job of making you question that along with him, because boy, does the government he belonged to suck.
Yeah.
They're pretty bad.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, you have Reinhard von Lohengram, and Reinhard is basically I'd say the best comparison to him is kind of like a Napoleonic figure, where he is, he's a young idealistic figure who wants to, improve his own, country, but also basically seize power because he sees how incompetent everybody else is around him, and basically is like, I could run this thing so much better. Everybody else here is doing a terrible job. Like what's the red tape? Let's get to it. Let's get to it.
Yeah, he's kind of like I would say like a Nietzschean Übermensch figure.
Sure.
If that makes sense. Like the one problem is that he is kind of like there's kind of like a faulty thing in history, or at least a criticism of certain historians who really subscribe to the great man theory. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of a little bit of a representation of that. I find with his character, it's kind of funny in that in the first half of the series, he actually does seem like really competent and kind of genius. But then the rest of the series is mostly just people talking about how much of a genius he is without really. It's all tell, not show. For the latter half, he was like, is he? Wait, I can't even remember him being a genius because he just keeps on losing.
Well, he doesn't lose so much as the sense, like, after a while, he's not so much involved in like the ship-to-ship strategic sense or the tactical sense. He's more in the overarching strategy, and that they do seem to call attention to the fact because he manages to manipulate himself into controlling. Spoilers. We're going to talk about a lot of spoilers probably about this.
Yeah, spoilers for a 30-year-old series. Yes.
Spoilers, but also I would say like knowing any of this stuff shouldn't stop you because it's more about the ride than it is about the destination. Because they do cover a lot of ground in this, and things go back and forth. And it's basically about him ultimately in a dictatorship conquering the entire galaxy. And it's just interesting how they juxtapose both him and Yang Wenli in the sense of both like not only ideals, but also the sense like, Reinhardt is a dictator, but he actually has a very fair government. He's kind
of like an egalitarian. What's the word for it?
He's like a benevolent dictator.
Benevolent, yes, that's the word. Benevolent dictator is essentially what he is, and he does like all these reforms. He basically staves off a French Revolution style thing because like they show it getting pretty bad in that specific empire.
Well, it's also the sense like even looking historically, like not all kings in history have been bad. The dictator has nothing to do with the fact that the quality of a government ruled by a single leader tends to be dictated by the quality of that leader in of themselves. Like people talk about like, oh yeah, Queen Elizabeth, she was a relatively fair dictator to, the people in her country as a queen. At the same time, her children end up causing, the English Civil War, or not her children, but her, the people who took up after her from her familial line,
well, that's why he ends up being a very good counterpoint to Yang Wenli. Like it's a really strong kind of two-sided viewpoint. It's an examination of Yang Wenli's, I think, political ideology in a lot of ways, where it's probing and kind of questioning it, and in the end, it doesn't really come up with an answer at all, which is fine. I think that aspect, there is no solid answer. I think it poses the question really well, and it makes some arguments and kind of provides some interesting scenarios in which you go like, well, it's a good thing he did have this kind of power here. Otherwise it would have gone, downhill. Or you have this character, was it John Truitt or something like that, who's kind of like the worst example of what a democracy can develop as a politician and things like that. So it does a really good job in that regard. I don't think my one big criticism of the series is I don't think it necessarily ends very well. And there's a couple storylines that I find just kind of distract from that. I think the Earth cult thing just... Yeah,
the Earth cult thing is the weakest part.
It's a really weak part. The series is so strong without having this mustache twirling villain aspect, and they could easily have kind of covered a medieval Catholicism style entity without having to go into that level of using like mind controlled drugs and like, it just gets a little that, and also just like the ending of that plot line is just really abrupt and strange, and it just really didn't do it for me.
I mean, there are little bumps around the road I think I liked about the whole terrorist, terrorist,
and that was not subtle.
No. But that there are bits of that I liked actually. Like some of the manipulation stuff was interesting, and the kind of like the politics of how that played out with.
Fezon ended up being the better version of that.
Sure, and though
I mean, just let Fezon have before they introduced that Earth cult thing. Fezon ends up being a really good stand-in. For a lot of things.
But even there, you had like Fezon also manipulating the Earth cult because you have the leader of that being very manipulative. They're technically part of it and subservient, but they're clearly just taking advantage of it to their own end. There's some interesting interplay though. Like the terrorist stuff really just falls apart towards like the last few episodes, where they start going like, oh, there's a dozen guys left here. It
looks like we got to end this.
Like I liked how I liked in general how that last bit ends with like the like how people die and like how it actually resolves the very end. But the actual showdown at that house was very narratively convenient in a way that felt very irrational. Like, oh, you're the emperor of all space, and we're having a fight at a mansion by 6 dudes with rocket launchers, huh? That's how we're doing this.
Yeah, well, I mean, and here's the other thing too: is if a series ever needed an epilogue, it would have been this one. Not to tell me exactly how everything was going to play out in the future, but just give me a little bit of where some of these characters were going, or just something. It just kind of
I see. They can't do that though.
Abruptly in certain.
They can't do that though because it ruins because remember, it ends on such an anxious note. Like that's the best part about it. Like literally ends with Mittermeier's son reaching for the stars and basically just going, oh, not again. Oh God. We're just like the anxiety of, oh, you too, Felix, you're also ambitious for this. Oh, just like this anxiety about the ambition of youths and how they want to seize control of everything. Like that anxiety is so important for like the end of it, because that's like the whole big and like one of the big circular things here is that things don't end cleanly in real life. Like there's no clean ending where everything goes full circle and like, okay, everything's great now. It's just
that's not what I was looking. I guess what I was looking for is more, at least a couple of the characters I could have gotten a little bit of what they were going to do. Just, I don't need like and then the government did this and then this person rose to power. Just like maybe just a little bit of like where Julian kind of started ending up, or where oh god, I can't remember some of the other admiral characters, Poplin and all this other stuff. Just like a couple things,
sure,
like a little bit. Like that's what I was looking for.
I like them leaving it up in the air. I don't want to know. I want to speculate in my brain. I don't want to actually know. It's better that way, in my opinion, to just leave you wanting more than to kind of go into an exhaustive detail. Like that doesn't feel like it fits. And also, like, I think the way they actually end it with that very final like narrator message is like, oh well, here's the point where legend ends and history begins, in the sense that, okay, all the crazy stuff that was happening in this one very specific story is over. Everything past this point is just it's just how people's lives go after this point. Things behind here were such crazy events going on specific to this one conflict and these very specific people, and they're both dead. So where do we go from here?
That was the other thing with this series too, is
there's
that
a lot of characters.
Well, no, I was thinking in terms of the opening that they made for it and the ending animations pretty much just tell you exactly what's going to happen to the characters from the pretty. Like that was a little bit like, oh come on.
I mean, hey,
they've telegraphed that it's going to get the narrative is going to get handed over to Julian, and that and also the next episode previews where it's like, next episode he dies. It's go. Damn it! Come on.
Well, don't watch next episode previews. You should know not to do that.
I know, but still,
you should know not to do that. But
really?
Yes. I mean, honestly, like I said, it's like the twists in the actual way, like, or what major events happen, like, or that, like, the fact that certain characters die is almost immaterial, because the political twists are so, not even like unpredictable, but they're so stark, and they aren't telegraphed, typically speaking. The political twists, I always think, when I think about some of the crazy political twists that are nuts, is like, when they allow the nuclear attack on that colony.
Oh yeah, the one where Oberstein sends the camera to pick up on.
They could have stopped those crazy nobles from nuking that colony, but instead they videotaped it, and it like that you could never have seen that coming. And they handle it very matter of factly. It's fucking horrifying, but they don't like break it up with like emotional. They do it very matter of factly. Where like Reinhard walks in the room, and it's like what is that? It's like, oh, they nuked that planet. We weren't fast enough. It's like, you got a camera ship there. You weren't fast enough. There's nothing you could have done. And it's like, and it haunts Reinhardt for the rest of his...
To be fair, it was also his choice to kind of not suddenly make that decision too.
Sure,
like
but
he procrastinated on making a choice, and it kind of is his fault on some level by not immediately going like, no, we're going to stop this.
And that haunts him for the rest of his life too. Like they think that happens early on, and he is continually haunted by that fact for hundreds of not hundreds, but like 100 episodes after that. Like that. Yeah, that's like
Well, here's the other thing too that's kind of funny about the series is the way it always it's that kind of war movie trope in a lot of ways, where it's like, oh, I just asked my girlfriend to marry. Oh no, you're gonna die. Stop getting married. You're good. That's exactly what's gonna happen to you. And they do it it happens a lot to an almost comical degree to me, where it's like there's this one where one of the generals like fires on his own supply ships to do like to create a barricade or something for him to escape, and they go like, we're gonna fire on our own ships. It's like, wow, sure glad I'm on a supply ship and not away from not on the battlefield. Hey, do you want to see a picture of my girlfriend? She sure is. No, what could happen? We're being fired on.
I mean, to be fair, that wasn't a surprise. Like they showed the guy attacking first, typically.
No, I know, but that's what makes it funny is they take the time to do that. Or it's like hey, let me take this handkerchief with me because I am certainly going to return it to you. bye, honey, that I woman that I just
the
married.
thing is, like, with millions of like hundreds of thousands of soldiers on some of these ships, like, they could have picked. Statistically speaking, there had to have been one guy on one of those ships that was doing like that, and they chose to focus on that guy to remind you how horrible this noble is for attacking
I'm talking
his own fleet.
I'm talking about the beginning of the series where it's one of the one of the early main characters.
Sure, well, no, but even there, like,
it's yeah.
it's framing this.
But it's just funny because it's just like on that planet that gets nuked. They're kind of like, gee, this is so great. We're finally free. Hey, let's join Reinhardt. He'll surely protect us and never ever betray. What's that ever?
Yeah.
I mean, I understand. I mean, it is entirely understandable. It's one of those tropes I always find funny because it is not subtle. I get why it exists. It's just, it makes me laugh every time.
Yeah. And
it's
then,
like stop getting girlfriends. This is how you die in a war movie.
Yeah. So what else have we not talked about with this?
Well, it has one of your favorite voice actors as Oscar von Royenthal.
I mean, it's got all my favorite voice actors because like every major character in this thing is voiced by a major like voice actor from the 80s and 90s. Like everybody is voiced by someone like important. It's great.
Yeah.
Like Reinhardt is the voice of God. I'm trying to remember what Reinhardt's Vegeta.
Oh yeah. Norio Wakamoto is Royenthal.
Yep. I'm trying to remember who else is major stuff. Oberstein is voiced by Kinito Shiozawa, who I also like a whole lot.
Well, he ended up being one of my favorite characters in the whole series.
Yeah, maybe we should just
not because I think he's a great person, but he ends up being really interesting.
Maybe we should just talk about some of these specific characters because that's the one thing is that these characters have way more depth than anything in anime has like any right to. They, given the fact that they have so many characters, they really deep dive on some of these guys in ways that is like.
Yeah,
great.
They give a background to a lot of people who are even incidental. And you know what I would say is it's not even just anime that it kind of impresses me in comparison to. I would say this is kind of what Game of Thrones wants to be, but instead is just, how can we gruesomely surprise someone and how can we increase the death total? I think this is kind of like the smarter version of that. In that you're seeing all these alliances, you're seeing all these competitions for power, and it's the who's going to overtake the throne, and you have both either a democracy and then you also have an empire, and it shows how people betray each other and the games they play within that, and I find it way more interesting than Game of Thrones does.
No, I agree. I mean,
I think it's stronger even in comparison to that. Like it's not just within anime.
Yeah, I mean, Oberstein's like a really interesting character in the sense that he is super methodical and logical to the point of being like frustratingly kind of like a dick about things. And he's so,
but you can't say he's wrong. That's the thing. He's always right. It's worse.
He's right, and he's sometimes just terrible about it. Like I hate that he's right. You're killing millions of people, and you're probably making the logical decision, but it's really inhuman. You dick.
But he's interesting because he's strong enough to take. He's aware of that too. Like he knows everybody hates him for what he's doing, but he's willing to take that on because someone has to do it. He has the most thankless position in this entire show.
Yeah, like he deliberately
he ends up orchestrating a lot of the stuff that happens. It's really him.
Like he manipulates like everybody around him to like lead to the end that he sees like necessary. To the point where he gives like, essentially gives like some major characters like the free reign to rebel just because like, okay, I know he's going to be insurrectionary at some point or another. This is going to kill millions of people, but it's better to do it now when we're ready than to have this happen later. And it's just like, there's a lot of crazy shit with that. Like, with him just like manipulating and then like ultimately like there's an interesting thing where they comment about like what leads to true good leadership. Leadership of, men, leadership as a military leader. And, Oberstein will never be a good military leader, despite the fact that he is a tactically and strategically brilliant, because it's impossible for him to actually inspire anyone to actually believe him or like actually want to follow him. That's his ultimate weakness.
They do a really good job talking about that kind of sense of morale and being able to have people trust you.
Yeah,
as a major important part of leadership. I would say the only character that kind of counters him would be Hildegard Mariendorf.
Sure.
Who ends up being kind of like one of the other female influences on it, and she's kind of like the only other. She's the one that he's not able to really manipulate her in a lot of ways, and she ends up doing a couple things that are pretty major in the entire series. Like she saves Reinhard's life in kind of like a master stroke and sets up his entire victory.
Sure, and like I mean,
he ends up not liking that. I mean, but she does it. She basically wins the war in the end.
I mean, she's also involved in a lot of the sense of like she takes a very more humane approach to government than either Oberstein or Reinhardt would do. Oberstein, of course, would like to basically not necessarily bathe people in things in blood. He's not cruel in the sense, but he's very practical. Whereas I think Mariendorf is very much more aware of the fact that, hey, you can win more things with people over with honey than you can with trying to do terrible things. And she ends up basically resulting in a bunch of the nobility not actually being killed off, which I bet Oberstein would have probably been more inclined to actually ultimately doing, which, well, that's for the better or the worse.
It makes sense from Oberstein's viewpoint because they introduced pretty much a genetic purity thing, and he would have been eliminated under under that kind of system.
Yeah, because he's blind, technically speaking.
Yeah.
He has cybernetic eyes.
Yeah.
But
man, the history of that empire in that episode where the original fascistic founder was himself like horribly defective in a lot of ways, and yet he was the one that did this whole creepy racial purity shit.
Yeah, he did this creepy racial purity shit, but he also his own children ended up being having genetic defects and stuff because that's not how things work. It doesn't work that way at all. But that whole thing, they actually talking about the old, Kaiser and the stuff, where the sense of that super interesting. With the whole rise of Rudolph, where they follow the fact that he is democratically elected as president of the old Galactic Republic, and then over time, they just give him more and more power, removing all checks and balances on him. And then ultimately people, essentially applaud as he gains, becomes president for life. Oh, he's emperor. And he also has this really weird hairstyle, and his face is orange for some reason. It's really odd. I mean, hey, this anime really it predicted the Iraq war debacle, and now it's predicted this. I mean, I don't know if this necessarily predicted that specific thing, but it's one of those things that's happened a lot, in history. You can. Oh yes, but you can look at Napoleon. You can look at even Hitler to a certain degree. Though that's a much more extreme seizure of power. You could look at I'm trying to think. But again, it was the specificity of the wording. Again, they will greet us as liberated. That one line got me was that. Yeah, that was so oddly specific. And they even had a whole bunch of kind of Baghdad Bob situations. There is a whole there's that Russian strategy of cut, burn and run. It was really interesting seeing how they applied a lot of these historical tactical styles and mistakes. And then they also had some interesting talk about from the standpoint of liberating people. They had that whole episode that was devoted to just one planet, of attempting to them liberating quote unquote one planet. There's one guy who's an agricultural expert who's going to land on this planet and help take care of the supply thing. And the second that their own supply lines get cut, they just start taking everything from them because yes, that's how that works. In fact, it's we're not going to take anything from you. We're here to help you. Our troops need to be supplied to keep fighting, so we're going to take all of your food. Oh, you're fighting us now, but this has gone horribly wrong. Oh, God. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like why in the U.S. Constitution there is that one article about, being forced to quarter the troops and things like that. That shit happens a lot. And it was kind of nice to see that the series thought about things like supply lines and stuff like that. It isn't a Star Trek universe where everything is plentiful forever.
So
Sure.
it actually thought about doing that. And also that guy just gets fucked over really bad, the agricultural guy. Like, boy, he does not get a good... He gets the short end of the stick. Oh, wait, there's another guy that tries to do the agricultural thing, and he's the one that gets fucked over. The one where he's forced to kidnap the really, really shitty prince.
I mean, that guy made some weird... That guy made some really arbitrary decisions. Like, if he hadn't ran to Fazan in the first place, he could have gone over to, Reinhardt's side. Instead, he was like, "No, I'm gonna go neutral place. I don't want to work for Reinhardt. I'm just gonna go farm."
Yeah, I'm just gonna become a farmer. But I liked the really shitty kid. That was such a great thing. The old
young Kaiser
dynasty. Yeah, that kid. Oh, that was so funny to me. It's just how shitty he was.
And how is
and then
but then how his own end comes. Although actually, the whole thing about the actual kidnap plot is super fascinating. Like the actual that series of episodes is really riveting. Like all the stuff that goes on with that, and then like the old guard that they had left for guarding the palace, and it's like, well, he's gonna. It's like they actually not just acknowledge outright. It's like if like they steal this kid from under him and we let him do that, he's gonna kill himself. Like he's gonna do it because that is the honorable thing out, and he is old guard. Like, are you fine with that? And it's kind of like, well, they let it happen. He lets it happen because he thought that this this gives us our raison d'etre for invading the Republic. If the Kaiser is kidnapped over there to set up a rogue's government. It's kind of like,
but then again, I think what the calculation ended up being is that it saved a lot more lives in terms of another Civil War aspect.
Sure, but it also
I think that was a part of the calculation. Like again, like these are all these really kind of inhuman calculations, and it's the trolley problem in a lot of these cases.
I mean, and it's interesting how they kind of talk about there's so much bravado in the series as well about how they handle
the whole honor thing and
naval battles, and like how much they disrespect that and also play respect to it. Like it's good to show mercy. They very big about that. At the same time, don't act like a fucking idiot. You don't have to the whole thing in the corridor where they bring the fortress in to fight against the Iserlohn. They bring the other fortress in, and they're like, "Oh, we're going to have like a shooting battle between our two giant fortresses." And then afterwards, Reinhardt is like, "Why didn't he just crash into the other one? We just had to get rid of the other fortress. There was no point in trying to win that battle. You didn't have to do like a naval battle. You just had to get rid of it. It didn't matter to actually control that. You just wanted a clear
lot of those
path."
characters end up doing like really stupid decisions because they're like, well, I need to add up this number of battle victories to my name so I can get this position. And they end up fucking themselves over really poorly because they're trying to move up in this hierarchy. I mean, so there's a whole bunch of very strange... It's the irrationality of systems in a lot of ways, or the inhuman nature of numbers and systems in a lot of ways. I think that it's kind of mirrored in the conflict between Mariendorf and Oberstein in their viewpoint of, Oberstein is kind of like... reminds me a lot of modern day capitalism and the business training where it's like, well, no, human beings behave like this model, number model on a sheet of paper, so we can just keep making policy assuming that's how people will behave and they'll just withstand it forever. It's that kind of viewpoint of the world.
I mean,
like a clockmaker kind of sense.
So I would say with Oberstein, like he seemed the truth is,
well, he's smarter than that, but
he was aware of the fact that he was causing, emotional pain, and he was just taking advantage of it. Like, one of the big questions is that he dies at the end in that terrorist attack, and one of the big questions is that he died on accident, or whether he was actually playing decoy, or if he actually intended it for himself to die there, because kind of like, okay, the Kaiser's ending here. I've fulfilled my role. Me being alive actually destabilizes the government more. It would probably be better for me in terms of things if I actually was killed here. That's one of the big questions. Yeah. Like he literally had written...
that's such a great thing to end him on, is to leave that unanswered.
I mean, they have things that, like, he literally had written instructions on him about taking care of his dog and stuff, which is like kind of like he knew he was going to die.
Yeah. Again, that's why he ends up being my favorite character, not because, again, I don't think he's like, a great person, but he's really interesting. Like the things that he has to balance, and he's fairly enigmatic in a lot of ways, but he has no charisma. So he's enigmatic but without charisma. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, all the characters have like a lot of really interesting characteristics. Like Royal, I think, is very interesting in the sense that he's so kind of brooding and like full of himself, but he's very loyal to Reinhardt. But at the same time, he's also tempted by the fact that, if Reinhardt had never existed, could I have also done what he had done? Like I'm not nearly as good as him at what he does in terms of inspiring things, but like he is like 90% there, where his own ambition, his own like sort of ego is kind of egging him on to try to do stuff. And it's partially driven by his horrible familial issues in the past that to want to, try to go, try to rise up. And that's why he ultimately ends up, being all insurrectionary.
What's really sad is the way in which he fails feels like he wasn't really given a proper chance to do it.
No,
like his failures from he had no chance, not because of his own incompetence, but situationally it was just
it's tactically unwinnable, But that's kind of interesting in of itself, because the question with that was he just committing a form of suicide there? Suicide wasting millions of lives, but a form of suicide.
Yeah, that's a interesting subject that they do bring up a lot of the time. Is it's like these ego things, this whole honor system is a lot of pointless death. Like they don't really glorify a lot of this. Like they'll interpersonally, like the people above, I mean, they'll kind of go like, oh, he died this honorable way and I respect him. It's like, but like a lot of people died for no reason, just to satisfy this one person's ego. Like at times it admits that, but then at other times it steps over that a little bit. I kind of wish there was a little bit more of the upstairs, downstairs kind of storytelling, where you got a little bit more of a sense of what conditions were like on the ground for like the public in a lot of these situations. Because they talk about things like, he did these political reforms and, the public is feeling this way. And, again, it probably would have stretched out the series even more to have to portray that, but it would have been a little bit stronger in terms of selling the necessity for Reinhardt to do certain things by kind of showing the consequence of it. Otherwise, a lot of these things end up remaining very abstract. I
mean, they did that a little bit with like the Free Planets Alliance, but in terms of the Empire itself, no, they typically didn't, show what life was like. They did a little bit here and there.
In the beginning, but they kind of drop a lot of it later, because they just go like, yeah, things are better now, bye.
It's also the fact that it would have kind of broken the narrative flow to a certain degree, but sure.
Oh yeah, like the whole thing would have been much longer. I find Julian a little bit boring.
Sure, you're not wrong.
He's kind of like a site, because like they kind of have to kill Yang Wenli halfway through. Just dramatically, I got why, but they couldn't have him end there, so they really just kind of created a hollow cipher for him with Julian.
And
then his romance interest is just completely like, whatever.
They kind of built up Julian a little bit over the course of the thing. Like he was interesting as a foil for Reinhardt, just as a kind of a person for him to talk to. It's his heir, presumptive, his adoptive heir. But at the same time, his victories and such don't feel that well earned, in the sense like you don't feel like, yes, I get why he is so great at this stuff. Like, no, like, he learned from Yang, from being around him all the time. But at the same time, like, the only times, I honestly, you feel more for his own successes when they actually had him, like, the little last bit with Reinhardt, where they tried breaking into Reinhardt's ship.
Oh yeah, like that's pretty much like the best that the character really gets. But before that,
a little
it's
stretch. Just
not really.
They do.
But again, he's still just a cipher for. He's just like he's the guy that got the baton from Yang and just kind of continues it. And there is a good part about how he, on one level, understands that, and that he's kind of resigned himself to not really be his own person, but become the inheritor of his will. In a lot of ways.
And they also comment
that there's a part of that that's interesting, but even then, that in and of itself does not necessarily make him a compelling character after that point.
Yes, and there's also some interesting commentary on the fact that, like, this handoff to him is not exactly the most Republican-ass thing you could think of. It's like you basically set up your own heir. And they call attention to the fact, and it's kind of like, look, things aren't nearly as good as you might ideally want in terms of how those things go down.
Well, they try to show it at least as a meritocracy, and that he has to keep on proving his mettle and things like that.
Though he gets a lot of opportunities to do so.
Yeah, and again, his romance subplot is the worst of the romances.
It's lame. Yeah, you're not wrong.
She's not an interesting character at all. Like, there's potential for her to be interesting, but they really just drop it badly. Yeah. I think Reinhardt in Mariendorf's thing is really funny when he finally is. He's so incompetent at everyday life and being emotional that it ends up being kind of adorable.
Well, yeah, because it goes from like they have a one night stand. He gets basically all worked up about it, and it's like, oh shit, let's get married.
Yeah, and he has no idea how to handle it. It's kind of.
I mean,
it's
be
really
fair,
cute. I don't think it's bad. I think it's really cute. I think it works really well. It's just really funny in a good way watching it.
Yeah. I think
it's a lighthearted thing. It keeps it. I mean, again, this whole thing without those types of moments would just be endlessly grim and drudgery without a little bit of a sense of humor. I mean, that's why I'm really thankful about the personality of Yang and a couple of his subordinates, is because otherwise it would have just been like, this is just sad. It's like the sad parts of MASH without the funny parts.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why they have Poplan and Konev in there as, like, wisecracking pilots to occasionally just give, like, some semblance of, like, here's what the common troops are thinking about this situation, like, being smartasses and just being rude as heck.
What is his name? Dusty Attenborough.
Who is not in the novels.
Ends up being but he ends up being a pretty good, kind of like a little bit of a foil in certain ways.
I mean, Dusty, the funny thing is Dusty as a character was entirely created just such that Yang's internal dialogue would have an external person for him to talk to at times.
Well, yeah, and that's what I mean, is he ends up working as that kind of foil for him, not in a normal foil sense, but in a, like, you need in a visual medium or a filmic medium, you can't just have it be internal narration without that back and forth.
And they give him a lot of good goofy stuff to do, like all the stuff with.
Well, they make him a little bit pretentious in certain ways, and I kind of like that.
I like where he's got a much more soldierly view than Yang does about stuff. Like, Yang doesn't like to think of himself as a soldier, whereas like Dusty's got a lot of like really kind of impudent kind of shit that he likes doing. Like the whole thing when he's
kind of like, again, it brings me back to MASH. He's kind of like the Hawkeye Pierce to the Trapper John. Like they work really well together in that regard. I thought in the first movie I liked them as a duo. I think also the what's his name, Kircheis and Roy and Reinhardt are much more interesting in the first movie in the way they interact.
I mean, Kircheis is
a strange
character.
Yeah, like he's too pure for this world in a strange sense, and they attribute a lot of tragedy to his death. Like it's
emotional tragedy for Reinhardt, though.
Oh yes, but they keep on going like, well, this wouldn't have happened if he was alive. It's like maybe, like, even like 5 years out, they're still going, oh, if this hadn't happened. I was like, yeah, but they're attributing a lot of events from that I go like, okay, this is getting a little bit much. I mean, but I understand emotionally. I think it works sense.
In the sense like Kircheis is basically like Reinhardt's like I wouldn't say like naivete,
the angel of his shoulder.
Yeah, kind of like like the more pure, like kind of like idealistic, view of like, oh, we're gonna seize the stars and make a good pure government. And when Kircheis dies, that's basically Kircheis' death actually corresponds directly, from an interesting narrative standpoint. Like the second that Reinhardt lets those lets or doesn't let those nukes go by. That's very shortly after Kircheis dies, and that's basically like and after that is right when Reinhardt's
then his sister exit the picture. Yeah, like she just goes like, bye.
Well, because she had a thing for Kircheis, and basically she has the same reaction that Reinhardt does to his death. Because she also blames herself because she basically said like, hey, Kircheis, you should be a friend with Reinhardt and like protect him and stuff, and then he fucking dies. She feels
he dies doing it. She
feels
did
responsible, and also she had a thing for him.
Also, the way he dies is kind of funny in that someone squirrels away a RPG inside of the corpse of the.
I mean, that doesn't even kill him though. Like
that's pretty awesome. It's
though. Bear in mind, like
well, that's not what kills him, but
it's the ring
leads
gun
to him.
that
I
kills
mean,
him.
It's the ring gun,
which is like fucking shit. That's a fucking like not very gruesome death,
Hacks.
but still horrible death though. Like the laser to the throat from the ring. Just like that, man, that's a horrible way to die. Like, it's not gory.
This whole thing has a lot of horrible ways to die. Again, like, they show people's, like, face, like, getting melted off, and, like,
you make it sound gorier than it is. Like, it has little bits of gore. Just to kind of...
I'm not saying it's all the time, but, like, you're not used to that. So, like, you're just watching this episode, and you're like, you're just suddenly going like, okay, they're going to cut inside this ship. Oh my God, what is his face? What is, and then they just go back to normal again. It's like, wait, no, you have to acknowledge what just happened here. No, like you can't just go back to space.
No, but that's a way of reminding you of like, it's always this terrible. We had to remind you how bad it is because you weren't paying attention. Like we felt you weren't emotionally invested
I understand that. It's still shocking and horrifying though.
Sure.
It doesn't lessen the, oh my God. It's still, it was just like out of nowhere. It's suddenly like horrifying. And then they cut to the one of the kids in the ship having a malapropism about pie. And it's like, what? Ah! Dear God.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, again, I'm not saying this is a criticism.
Yep.
It's a feature. It's just a horrifying feature that just, dear God, someone had to draw this.
Yeah, they put a lot of frames into those intestines popping out of that one guy's body, trying to scoop them back in. In fact,
yes, it is.
It's like I gotta put these back in. Oh, and like they spend a lot. Like it's like they spend like a good like 20 seconds on like that scene, and it's like wow.
And this is before the Saving Private Ryan thing.
Yeah.
This is before that famous thing. And there's also even the stuff that's like not like lingering on that, like just in general, all of the axe battles are just like Jesus.
Horrible.
And some of the and like when the ship explodes, it isn't just like, okay, we cut to the outside of the ship. It's like, no, but we get to watch some of these commanders like just there's no grace in that death. It is like watching a Fallout game where like one of the main villains suddenly gets turned into a pile of goo. Like there's some weird lack of dignity in some of these deaths. It's very strange. Yeah. But what's kind of cool is that sometimes you don't know, like, there is a bit of foreshadowing in the series, but it isn't always.
Yep. So
there is kind of interest in seeing like how some of the stuff plays out, and that some of these characters didn't necessarily bring out their own downfall. It's just the way it plays out.
So, yeah, sometimes there's some horrible luck and shit. Like there's some bad stuff that just happens like totally inexplicably.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it interesting is it has that kind of historical view. I mean, as when I talked about the fact that like, yeah, it doesn't have a definitive ending, and you were right in saying things like, hey, history doesn't have a definitive ending. There is a repetition, and there are uncertainties, and it is a folly for people to think that things will always continue forever as they have always been. I thought that ended up being one of the most interesting points in that series. I think again, just looking at the way things are now, is that it's coming from this kind of post World War II view of the world, in that we're so used to the borders existing as they are, and in certain that concept called the end of history. It's kind of like we've been lulled into the sense of like, okay, well, things will just always continue the way things are. Systems are in place to prevent. It's like, well, it's like, no, like 70 years ago, people thought things were going to continue as always, and then shit went down. So I think it has a really strong viewpoint in bringing that kind of thing up. I mean, like, the government that Yang spent all his time trying to, work for, that offered him his, he often bring up his pension, and like that, that ends up disappearing entirely. It's just gone. And it's kind of like a natural process of history that people really don't want to admit.
Sure. And, they focus very much on the march of history in the sense that, governments rise, governments fall. And they also talk about the fact that, things aren't black and white in any case about how, the wars between governments or, wars are, they basically said there's no real war between, good and bad. It's typically between a good and another good, or, somewhere in between, in the sense that, there's not necessarily a hero and a bad guy. The number of wars that are like that are few and far between. We can look back at
well, that's why the Earth cult thing ends up being so weak.
Yeah, to a certain
because
degree. Yeah. I mean,
well,
that ends up not
the way they portray it is the way they portray it with the robes and the
sure,
the dark
it looks
emperors.
goofy.
Like that's the
yes,
and
absolutely.
that's the part that and that's why I felt it was the weakest, is because it undermines otherwise such a really strong,
I mean, there are
point.
some interesting commentary about that, about the nature of terrorism and such, or the
the nature
of religions,
it's just
for example, as the opiate of the masses, and also how religion relates to the and cults relate to the attempt to control people. But they also show a lot of people who are part of that religion who aren't terrible. For example, hey, they have a bunch of people on Fazan that are terrorists, and they're not bad people. But there's also people even in that leadership who aren't necessarily terrible. But then you go into yes, they go on the side they also have the sinister people trying to recapture the historical past by making Earth, the center of the galaxy again. And I think they could have done that better, but they have a narrative there that just doesn't juxtapose well with the other major narrative of the war between the two, major factions.
Yeah, there's a concept in there. It's just not executed very well.
Sure.
I think that's what it is. I think again, it's trying to be kind of looking at historically the way the Catholic Church interacted with nations and wars and things like that, and it's kind of trying to do that. But again, the clothing aspect, the color choices, the oh yes kind of portrayal of things was just okay, now. It stylistically is not gelling here.
Sure. No, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
And
so
I'm trying to think about.
Well, again, Fezon ends up being much more interesting as a way of executing that.
Sure.
Or he's also one of the worst characters in the series in terms of just as a bad person, but Job Truehit.
Oh God.
Being this he is a really fascinating character in a certain sense. Again, he's probably the worst person in the entire series.
Oh, yeah.
But he is kind of fascinating in that you kind of see people like him in history constantly. This completely self-serving, just the ultimate traitor. He is the epitome of traitorous behavior.
He's very much like the kind of person where he clearly has no actual ideals or belief. He will essentially
beyond himself, yes.
He'll espouse or ultimately assume any power that basically leads him to have more control. But then he'll just at the same turn around and be like, oh yeah, good job. He will kiss ass where it's required. He's got no morals and real restrictions on that regard. He's a terrible person. He's kind of like the worst. They kind of call out. He's like the worst kind of person to have happen to a democracy, except for a case where if you had someone who is so charismatic that they take over the democracy and then change it.
Oh yes, and that was the original.
That's the fall of the
Emperor
Republic
character. Yeah. The one that really sucks is the guy that inherits Truehit's position afterwards, where he's not necessarily a bad guy, but he is forced into the worst position possible, and it just ends so badly for him.
That's also one of the messed up things, that Truehit doesn't even get a bad ending. He ends up
no, he gets killed, but he doesn't.
I don't think he remember does he? I thought he ends up.
He does.
Does he?
He gets killed, and they're like, oh, it turns out he was trying to bring down the Empire from the inside, but not because for ideological reasons, but because he was going to try to do the same thing there that he did other places.
Oh right, that's right. Ryantal shot him in the face.
Yeah,
that's right. I remember
yes,
that was entirely spite. That was just entirely spite. And that was
great.
That guy.
I loved it.
Just like Ryantal had no reason to do it. He just didn't like him.
I can do this. Well, this is, I think, when he's dying, isn't it?
I believe so. That's right.
Yeah, like Royenthal is in the middle. Like he knows he's not going to make it. He's like, you know what? If I'm going to die, I'm going to do like that movie, God Bless America, and shoot this guy in the face because, you know.
He's like, you're just a terrible person. Like, he didn't even have, like, Royenthal by no means was a Republican, but at the same time, everybody hated Trunit because, like, he's so scummy that even when his interests benefited the Empire, nobody liked him because he had no character whatsoever. Like that's
Oberstein pretty much just sent him off to die, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of interesting thing in there, like talking about the fact that, you know, there's a war and a conflict to a certain degree, you know, ignoring some of the Civil War stuff that happened at certain points in the sense of war between two different goods, of like the amount of respect that the two different sides have for each other, but they're also very much reserved to the fact that, look, we can't resolve this from a political standpoint. There's no peaceful resolution to this. You know, our beliefs are too diametric. We respect each other, but we also still need to kill each other in order to, you know, play this thing out to its bitter end, essentially. Like, you know, the thing I think about...
Well, the two ideas cannot coexist with each other. So, like, the democracy aspect cannot, you know, exist with a kind of soft, even benevolent fascism, just, you know, will not work, and a fascism cannot, retain itself if the concept of democracy is possible. So they go like, well, there is no compromise.
Sure.
You can't compromise these two sides. They both have an argument in this regard, but one cannot exist while the other thrives.
Yeah, like the one scene I always think about with regards to that is Admiral Bucock's death, the old guy.
Oh, yes. I kind of like the fact that they didn't do this whole thing of every amazing character has to be super young. Yep. Some of these older generals like are really good and kind of badass, and they kind of respect the fact that, like, well, the reason these guys win is because, like, they have so much experience and they're able to outmaneuver this other, young, cocky person.
I mean, Bucock retires like for like half the series because he's like, "Oh, I'm an old grandpa. I'm way too old to deal with this stuff. I'm gonna go raise bees." And then he comes back later just to basically like, "Well, the nation's gonna fall unless I do something, so I better do something." And then his death is just great, where they actually have like Reinhardt basically call him up, like, "Look, you have no way of winning this. Why don't you just give up and join us?" And his Bucock's like, "Look, I've lived my entire life as a Republican. I'm not exactly going to go over to, a dictatorship. It's like, I don't want to be ruled by somebody or rule over anybody. I want to, be equals with friends, It's like, that's it. They go and they kill him. And they don't want to do it.
And then there's also Merkatz, who's kind of like the mirror version of him too.
Yeah.
So he ends up being in it. I mean, again, it's nice because we're so used to... Go ahead.
Merkatz is weird, though. Like, his motivations are always kind of hard to follow to a certain degree.
Yeah, because it seems like at one point he says, "Oh, I'm going to have that little shit prince become like the ruler again." And then they just drop that entirely.
I mean, because that wasn't going to succeed and ended up causing, like, the whole thing is like, he had more loyalty than sense.
Yes.
And like more loyalty than sense in the sense like he was loyal to a failing regime. That regime failed, and then rather than accept an offer that he clearly would have had available to him to join the new regime, even though that old regime like failed him, he felt like he only had loyalty to that old regime, and then basically he had no other reason for living. But then his loyalty to the old regime is such that he was willing to go over to, the Democratic side just to fight the new regime, even though he was
out of spite almost.
It was almost out of spite, like, because he just couldn't, like, I'm trying to remember the way they worded it. It's like oh, like the old. I don't think he verbalized this, but someone else, like one of the other guys, like the guy who killed Kirkiais, voiced it in the sense of like, oh, the old regime has fallen, but that doesn't mean that the new regime has to be Reinhardt.
Yeah,
kind of thing. Like, I think it's that kind of mindset of like, look, he's opposed to because even in that old government, like, it had a Kaiser like, the old empire. Yes. But they also had more power for the nobility than, they had in, because they had kind of like an oligarchy type thing, because the Kaiser had built around the nobles around him to secure his power base. Whereas Reinhardt had no use for that at all, because his power base was entirely the military. Whereas the old military...
And then he dismantled a lot of, once he got in control, he pretty much dismantled a lot of that nobility aspect.
And in the other case, the officers of the old government's military were all, nobility. So they went one and the same, whereas... Reinhardt essentially created a government of technocrats and, military veterans who were skilled and, exceptional in that degree, and made the government out of that, as opposed to, making a new nobility. Though you could make the argument that, given additional generations, is this just the birth of a new nobility? Are you going to have like a descendant of Mittermeier basically being yet another, noble that has way too much power? They don't say. We don't find out. That's one of the things they leave really ambiguous, and they kind of leave the question of like, oh, are we going to totally enter the cycle, or are we going to get something new by the fact like, hey, Julian is trying to induce the empire to become parliamentary, but we never figure out at all how that goes. You get the impression that Marendorf is, more amenable to it, but who knows? She doesn't necessarily have all the power. She's just the Kaiser's, dead Kaiser's wife. How much power does she actually wield? Hard to say.
Yeah,
they leave that up in the
difficult. Air. But I think what's also kind of interesting is even on the Democratic side, they did the idea that you develop a kind of a political and military class that is a lot like a nobility in a lot of ways, and that concentrates power and wealth within its own kind of family system and people that and kind of a what's the word for it, cronyism and things like that. So it's interesting. It's the idea that I think the series seems to have kind of a view that no matter which system of the two, hierarchies kind of start developing and calcify, and they kind of have to almost be destroyed and refreshed constantly, or else they become unjust.
Sure. Though they also call attention like the kind of the Republic early on, in its very early years, speaking about the Free Planets Alliance specifically, like they specifically call that attention as being like, okay, the Free Planet Alliance in its early years was actually a very honest, democracy, or they don't.
Oh yes.
They don't talk about like how it starts off good, but they also specifically call the fact like, oh, they also had the thing where they then allowed, like, the second they had the government established and they re-established communications with the Galactic Empire, all of the the rogue elements from the Empire end up fleeing the Empire for the Republic, because they had both people who were sympathetic and were wanted democratic, but they also had people that were like people ousted in coups, or people who were definitely had no actual vested interest in the success of the Republic becoming Republican citizens. Because the thing is that as much as you could hope that your government, the people who found it will have this one ideal, it's like, generationally speaking, that's not going to hold, because people are going to have different ideas, and they kind of starkly call attention to it here by having like people coming back with those ideas.
Yeah.
But or new people coming in. It's like, oh, these new people have ideas who aren't necessarily honest or whatever. But like that's kind of a microcosm, or little small element of all like the political shifts that are happening there, because some of the leadership, like even then, like some of the leadership of the Free Planets Alliance do have a vested interest in, democracy and republics, even the really scummy ass ones. Like you had that one lady who was like, when they're talking like, we have to invade the Empire because, everybody defers democracy, and, it's a divine right to help our friends in the Empire, be entered into democracy. And it's like, okay, sure, maybe, but also you're still going to be killing millions of people to accomplish this. And also we can't do this right now. Like there's a very the interesting that the people you want to be sympathetic in that discussion is the people literally just practically saying like, look, we don't have the money, we don't have the people, we're literally eating into our like experienced people base, we don't have experienced engineers anymore because the military is taking them all. Like our road structure, our infrastructure is just falling apart because we don't have the skilled like civil servants anymore even.
Yeah.
It's like there's some
Again, it's that Napoleon kind of historical aspect.
Yeah, there's just some really just like there's so much interesting political commentary that you can find in here if you just dig deep. Like like I said, some of it.
And again, it's really nice is that it never solidly sits there and says, no, this person was exactly right.
No, it just
and
raises
that's what's
questions.
kind of nice about it. It has but it's able to do that, but still have a point of view.
Sure,
If that makes sense. Like it's able to have a point of view without being, I'd say, without being didactic. It's able, without sitting there saying the moral of the story is specifically blank. It's like, well, no, it brings up all these different things and then shows how they play out when butting up against each other. But it knows enough not to sit there and be too definite about everything it doesn't show its hand too much.
I'd say to a certain degree, it's like more that there are many questions that they raise and many conundrums that they raise that they basically say like these conundrums are fact, like governments fall, fact, like that, governments become flawed. There's not necessarily a good an ultimately pure form of government. It's an ideal republicanism. It's an ideal you aim for, maybe. But they all at the same time they also don't give a lot of answers to those questions. They say those questions,
yes.
like I don't feel like they necessarily gave a concrete answer to the fact that like even the big question of like, is a flawed republic better than the best dictatorship? Yang Wenli certainly believes so. But at the same time, like there's, I think we all can kind of relate to the notion that like, hey, there's something darkly appealing to, a what you might consider being an
authoritarian system.
Benevolent authoritarian system, or even like a ruler by technocrats, even in a sense like, oh, competent people are ruling, or like, hey, it's democracies are stable to a certain degree by the fact that it's very difficult to enact change within the system. It's part of their way of answering.
But then when change becomes necessary, it's unable to act.
Sure, and that's one of the things, and and that's partially structurally built in there, such that they can't tear themselves apart, and two, so it's not easy for democracies to make themselves into dictatorships, or so that they can't undo their own structure. That's one of the fundamental questions and one of the fundamental struggles of democracies in general. But then you look at dictatorships and they can do anything at any point, for good or for bad. How many in the series they don't show them directly that much, but they talk a lot about like the major reforms in the government and the structure that that Reinhardt institutes in the Empire, and it's like to a certain degree, after a certain point, the Empire ends up being a much more, egalitarian government than the Republic is. You don't actually have ownership in the actual ruling, but there's even freedom of press in the Empire after a point, and that's not necessarily anything you can say about the Republic after a while. There, like they have the whole thing with the government.
Oh yeah, they literally do have.
It's there. It technically exists, but the government, instruments are so intertwined with the press, and they have repression, subtle repression mechanisms that are subtly behind the scenes endorsed by the government, that it's functionally not there, even though it's actually there in the law. So like, the Empire was able to fix that stuff, snap of the fingers, within, essentially a few years, because Reinhardt willed it. But, like Yang Wenli said, like...
Well, it also requires again, the great man theory, or, this Nietzschean Übermensch person to be able to do so.
But even...
Like, that's...
I mean, even history, we've seen those in history in the sense that, one person seizes all the power,
the reformer and things like that. But again, like the idea is that, the series does a really good job of presenting these types of things, but none of it is, prescriptive. Like the series does not say, I have all the answers. This is how you form a utopia. Done. Point proven.
In fact, it says like
it never does that. And I think that's
exist.
What makes it so strong is that it goes like, well, yeah, like here's the kind of eternal conflict between these two, and how one can go really well and how one can go really wrong, and then 100 years later, the one that was going really well completely reverses itself. Like it shows that, human history is a constant ocean of flux, an up and down of progress and regression and reactionary and progression, and like it does a really good job of doing that. Well, again, it's not wishy-washy either. It has a point of view, but it's not. Again, it's not prescriptive. It doesn't say like I have all the answers.
Sure.
And that's what makes it, I think, a really strong series.
Yeah, and like there's an interesting really question about here with their focus on history in it. Yang Wenli's a historian. It's the entire story is framed as kind of like a historical legend or a historical tale. But like the sense that history is about the inheritance of knowledge and ideals. It's about passing on to future generations, like a notion and an idea, like this is how you should do things, or learn from these people or learn from the past. But another thing they also talk about and they refrain on, and the sense their legacies are important in the sense that you have Yang Wenli hanging off to Julian Mintz, but you also have like how fragile they are because you also have like all these biological legacies that just. There's no coherency to them because that's not how people work. They're more chaotic than that. People's interests aren't so predictable. It's the interesting challenge where they have it. Like it's yet another question they're raising, the fact that like they're so focused on like you have to pass down these ideals, this knowledge. Like at the end they're very much like, okay, the Republic is dead, but we have to pass on this notion, this flame of republicanism into the future such that, at the very least, maybe someday we can, accomplish something within the Republican framework in this government. They're playing the long game here. And, but at the same time, it's totally unable to predict how the future will actually go, how people would actually operate in that characteristic because some of the successors to the first Kaiser Rudolph, they followed their whims entirely because of their upbringings. And, Rudolph had no way of controlling that. Nobody has any way of controlling that. Things went completely haywire because over the genetic history, there's no predictability. And then, it's impossible to impress ideals on future generations in so clear a way. And that's why the Free Planets Alliance weakened.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question.
It's the idea of that human history is a history of chaos.
Yep.
That human nature is not easily it's not easily defined, it's not easily modeled perfectly every single time. There's certain kind of general principles, but you can't data mine yourself into the future. Sure.
But it's interesting also the sense like they say that is the case, but you also need to try. It's because it's not like the way we describe it.
It's not. It doesn't say it's not nihilist. It's it doesn't say give up. But the idea is that you have to kind of understand that nothing is permanent. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you should just give up.
Nothing's permanent.
It's smarter. It's smarter than what a nihilist would do.
Sure, because they talk about
it's not grim in that regard.
I mean, because they also talk about the fact hey, we're what we're aiming for here is to get a peaceful generation, a peaceful few decades for some people, and that perhaps it's good enough, in the sense it's not. It's even when Yang Wenli talks about democracy. It's like you're aiming for an ideal, not necessarily because you can achieve an ideal, not because you necessarily, are living in an ideal, but because a good democracy, a good republic is an ideal that you need to aim for. And that there's something you can really take away for modern day, real life in the sense there's a lot of reasons that, people certainly are very nihilistic about the state of our current government, for example, or any government. There's a lot of reasons, to be critical about this,
or just human history in general.
Sure.
There's plenty of people that just go everything's pointless, and then
But you still have to try and aim for an ideal in the sense that yes, things are bad, but you still have to aim for the future, such that even if things aren't, just to try to make things better for the next generation. You may not succeed. You can't control at all what the next generation is going to do, but perhaps if some good decades for people, that's good enough. If you can achieve that, whether or not you can, who can say? It's totally unpredictable.
But better to try. Yep. Well, again, I think the series overall it's neither cynical nor naive. And again, it's able to do so without doing a truth is always in the middle sense either.
No.
Like, again, the fact that it's able to avoid that is its greatest power, because that is such a, it's, doing the whole, like, South Parkism thing is so easy. And it can often masquerade itself as being, considered and above it all, or, logical, or, intellectual in a certain way. But it's actually a very simplistic and easy way of viewing all situations, while just giving the appearance, of intelligence and being, elite. This series is able to avoid that while still saying, well, here are the various sides of the issue. Here's how they play out. There is no answer, but that doesn't mean there's hopelessness.
And they don't necessarily...
And that's what makes it, again, it makes it interesting. That's a big part of that. And I'm just impressed that it was able to accomplish that. While, yes, I think, certain elements of the plotting and characterizations aren't perfect, but
Nope.
I mean, again, what work is, it has a lot more in common with older literature, I think, than a lot of people might be used to.
Sure.
In both a good and a bad way. I think what it comes down to it in terms of your enjoyment of the series is if you come at it with the right expectation. Like it's an understanding that this is a genre piece. It's understanding what is a space opera, like what is the point of a sci-fi story and things like that. Like, coming to this for a Star Wars style story does not make, it's going to let you down. It's not what this kind of thing is trying to be.
Yeah.
And understanding that is kind of a key importance to when you're approaching any kind of work is understanding, like, well, what is its intent? And also, sometimes what are the stylistic faults that you kind of have to forgive because, well, like, this is just the way the genre works. Like, you kind of have to understand those mechanics.
Sure. And also when you flip it on the other side, like, this is also so unlike anything else in Japanese animation, or kind of out of it to a certain degree in terms of, just like, animated or, cinematic mediums. Like, it's very, very different. There's not a lot that's comparable. Like, I can't really...
Again, even in Western media, we really don't tell these types of stories anymore.
Sure, like there's like novels,
especially animated or televised. Like,
sure,
we just really
absolutely.
don't do those types of things.
I mean, there are certainly science fiction novels and other novels such that have sort of similar views on history and ask similar questions. And
but in terms of
tales.
like to mainstreamize it, like to sell it to the public in the the undertaking it would be to turn that type of thing into an animated series. Like, I think in America and various other countries, like, no one would think to try to tell this type of story in this medium. So, like, yes, there's going to be plenty of novels. I even said, like, it reminds me much more of a Russian novel, but very few people would think, well, let's turn this into an animated series like that. I think that's also just in general what I find really refreshing about Japanese animation in general is that, yes, there's, tons of frivolous, capitalist garbage crap produced, but the risk-taking, the willingness to try different genres in this medium is what keeps it being very fresh. And I think the West is also starting to do that too. Like, we're getting used to the idea of telling different types of stories in the medium. We're just a little bit more reticent and a little bit slower at getting to that. But I think we're kind of developing along those lines. And, I think, the series is an example of the risk in the Japanese market paying off.
Yeah.
Creating something that no one else would have done.
There's something interesting about the fact also, like, like, this is very much a work that comes out of the old style of the the actual way of producing and selling anime, in a sense that this was an OVA.
Yeah.
It was direct to video. Mm-hmm. It was priced exorbitantly expensive to a very small market. Like, this is like the kind of work where we've begrudged so much of anime for that, that kind of marketing, that kind of business model, for the sense like, okay, they're making some sort of shitty fetish thing just because from the standpoint of like, oh, the crazy fetish moron will buy like $1,000, bust of the boobs from the boob anime. I gotta get that boobs. I gotta hang those boobs on my wall.
Could you make this into a mouse pad with some silicone inside, so that way my wrist will sometimes feel like it's touching another human being?
Yes, but like that's one side of it. But then you also can from that exact same business model get things like this, where it's kind of like, okay,
yes,
there's not a mass market appeal for this. They charged a fuck ton for this back in the day. And in fact, the DVDs for like this entire series, I think when it came out, the full
even now
the whole DVDs for this thing in Japan was like $1,500 or something for the whole series.
Yeah.
That's like, which is fucking
well,
crazy.
considering what, like 5 episodes of a Blu-ray disc is usually like $40, let alone something that lasts about 112 episodes.
Yeah.
Divide that by 5, multiply that by 40.
Yeah, like, yep. So,
You know.
to a certain degree, that it's not unexpected, but at the same time, like, nobody's going to buy Legend of Galactic Heroes and be like, oh, I'm going to go try this Legend of Galactic Heroes at random. I'm going to go see, like, I don't really have interest in the space stuff, but maybe I'll like this. Because, like, the pricing was not, did not support that. People weren't going to air.
Well,
also, who owned a Laserdisc player?
Yes. Well, even then, so let's additionally go, like, these days you can sample this type of stuff. Like there is no risk in, being able to see like a trailer or try something out for a couple episodes. It's really easy to do that now. Back then it's like, well, how else were you going to even be exposed to this thing outside of maybe going to a rental shop or buying the first, Laserdisc or videotape?
I mean, to a certain degree, also, like, one thing we've never really talked about in too much detail is that, like, video rental, or in this case, disc rental, has been a major industry in Japan for ages, and that's also a huge part of this, in the sense that, like, while, basically nobody bought major releases, even, in the period when, DVD and Blu-ray purchases was at its peak, because the rental business was a major driver. Like, that's partially why the prices were so high, is because, the rental industry drove a lot of that. Everybody rented in Japan. Like, they still have, their Blockbuster equivalents. People still rent over there because that's what made more, financial sense, for them. It's
was able to extract income from a given project over a longer period of time.
Sure, and people,
because let's say you produce this one DVD, you get 100 people to pay a rental fee for this one DVD over a period of time. You have made more money on that one DVD than you did from someone just buying it.
Yeah, and you also have the thing, like, with their pricing like this, nobody, like I said, nobody's going to necessarily spend the $1,500. But whereas, like, in theory, someone might rent the whole of Legend of Galactic Heroes over a very long period of time. Though.
Well, and it's very similar to the way streaming services are now.
Sure.
Like, they produce these TV series, with pretty high cost, but, individually, you're only paying like a certain amount of dollars a month. But it's the idea of long-term people wanting to watch these shows and starting to sign up for these subscription services, etc., that it's kind of, they're able to now make their money back in ways that they kind of weren't able to initially, when everything had to be sold one and done, get that person to buy the tape. Otherwise, we get nothing.
Yep.
The models have really changed in a lot of ways. But also just the public's expectation has changed. Again, like, you're able to watch series like these or any upcoming series. You can kind of test things out. You can see for yourself before then making those purchases, versus before you really had to take the risk, to be able to see it. And then go, oh, right, I like this.
Yeah.
So a lot of that has really changed. Like, I think we're really just in a period of flux right now with these models and how the content is being produced and how to monetize the content. I mean, a lot of these major industries we have now in the tech industry are just like, we have this huge audience, we have this many number of users, but we can't make any money off of it. We're Vine. It's one of those kind of situations, but even with traditional media, it's people are just trying to figure it out. Like, how do you employ people to make it? How do you make it worthwhile to produce these shows and being able to have an income and survive and do so? We live in a capitalist system, and the raison d'être of something existing in that system is to make a profit, to be able to stand on its own in that regard.
But even ignoring like a capitalist system, like, when do the benefits, you might say, of a capitalist system, or, something where it works like this is, like, if you're making a work for if you only make works for a mass market audience, there's a whole lot of very niche works that won't necessarily get out there. If you're aiming only towards a mass market, like, okay, I have to get as broad an audience as possible because that's the point of it. BBC produces works very frequently that are aimed at a very broad audience because, like, we're government funded. We produce government funded works for everybody. They don't necessarily, they tend to pick, with BBC in particular, they tend to be very intelligent about it. They do try to pick, one-off works here and there. But like something like, if you look at Legend Galactic Heroes, like that has no mass market appeal. It's got a very niche appeal, and it was probably very, very expensive. They made that first movie. That first movie did very well for them. And they're like, okay, we can keep doing this. And so they kept doing it. They did it at a lower production value so they could animate the whole series and not just, the stuff that was, tied to that first movie. But they kept going. If once you take that away, the business model of like, okay, you can have people spending a lot of money to make things work, you lose a lot of works. And we kind of see this day, it's kind of fallen out of favor to a certain degree, but like the Kickstarter model is essentially an extension of that, where it's kind of like, okay, these people want this type of work and they are willing to fund it. Like major studios, major publishers aren't necessarily going to fund, some of these narrow, very specific works because they don't necessarily have the interest in it. Like they don't necessarily see the money and like, look.
Or they think it's just too risky, or they're unable to manage the risk of, doing so. Because again, like how do you know whether or not a audience out there, even if it's niche, will embrace it? There is no way of telling. But the system in which a lot of business operates requires some kind of data model to be able to predict that it will work every single time. And it's asking the impossible in a lot of these models.
And that's one part of it, in the sense that you don't necessarily know if there's an audience. But like one point of comparison you can make is that if you look at like Hollywood, look at like the Marvel cinematic films. Like those are films engineered for a mass market. Like to be honest, I like those films in general. Like I think there's a number of films in there that I like, but there's certain aspects of them where it's just like, okay, this feels like this was done to a science less than, like something like, okay, we have to do this type of thing and do it this way, not necessarily because it's risky to do otherwise, not because it's risk adverse, but because we know that we're going to get a massive financial return if we do it this way and do it this specific way. Not because like the other way would not make a profit, but because like for the amount of money that we're investing in this project, and we can only invest our money in a certain amount of projects, we want to get the largest possible return.
It makes me think of like a Skinner box, in the sense that they'll just keep kind of doing the same thing. They'll hit the same button trying to get the treat until the treat stops working, and then they get electrocuted, then they move on to the other button.
Sure. And then, there's certain degree.
It's just following that instinct. And then what the weird thing is the audience also kind of being affected by that type of thing as well. So like who's really kind of in this, it's a chicken and an egg scenario, is like, are the audiences guiding the studios to deliver what they want, or are the studios starting to set the expectations in the audience of what the medium is supposed to be about? And it kind of, there's a back and forth and a tug of war, I think, over time. And the audiences often eventually rebel. And so studios have to go like, okay, wait, shit, new thing. And then a new trend starts. I mean, superheroes were a thing in the 90s. Then they kind of disappeared for a bit. Now they're back. Like it comes in waves. And I think the audiences eventually go like, okay, yeah, now what will you offer me? Like, what have you made for me lately?
And like, eventually we're going to eventually get the point where like everything is aiming to become like a massive franchise now, because there's a lot of money to be making with an expanded universe. And, like eventually people will get tired of that. Like that's inevitable.
Will eventually be unsustainable. Like you'll have a generation of people who are like, the first movie in the series was like way before I was born. Why do I give a shit?
Yeah. And like, like it's gonna fall apart eventually. And that's always the interesting thing looking at this is that people are, often flipping back to the political discussion, type of stuff, or the politics, like Legend of Galactic Heroes. Like people think very much in terms of the present now. Like things as they are now,
really.
Yes, but also like how it is now is how it's always going to be. Like the past is bunk. Like this kind of sense, like, well, cinema's dead now. We're all Marvel films. That's all it's going to be. All movies are going to die. There's going to be nothing else. Where, the thing is, like, nothing in life is so consistent. Like, we don't even know if movies will still exist after a certain while. Like,
or at least not in the form that we recognize them.
Yeah, and like, but that also goes for even things like narrative forms. Like nobody has made a perfect formula for the narrative. Like that'll get them forever. Like we can keep just changing the names in this thing and always work because we've made the perfect engineered thing for humans. Like maybe we'll get that someday for we've scientifically calculated that if we have the rise and fall here, people will get the right kind of endorphins. But
well, we can't even do that with medicine.
Sure.
Let alone art. I mean,
I think that's very low odds. Yes, I agree.
Yeah,
that's like that. But that's the idea, like that they can structure things and do it that way. But I don't think they can succeed. And I prefer to be.
Oh yeah, I agree that there is
if you don't like how things are now, eventually it will change.
Or be
for better or worse
you want to see in the world.
Sure, but like it might change for better, it might change for worse. It'll certainly change. And that like you said, that goes back to the whole government stuff in Legend of Galactic Heroes. Is that there's no such thing as consistency and in anything in life.
Permanence. That it's a very Japanese concept in terms of like literature. Is that it embraces impermanence. Which is the things like mono no aware, which is like a literary concept about the beauty and sadness of the impermanence of things.
And it's also interesting looking back at Japanese politics themselves, and also like kind of the flow of like Japanese culture. Is that Japanese culture is very backwards looking in the sense that it's got a sense of nostalgia to its past.
Well, it also had a 300-year period where it was like, we're going to just try to make this forever.
Yeah, where it's like, we're not going to acknowledge that the world's changing.
No influences, just is. But exactly.
But it's very backwards looking in the sense, but at the same time, like, it's kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily fragile, but kind of empty. Like, it's the whole thing where it's like, it's a country that is got like all these religious, ceremonies and all these like cultural practices built in there. But there's very little in the way of actual faith in any of it. Like, there's kind of like...
So it's like going through the motions?
Yes, that's what, yes, exactly. Whereas there's like this very going through the motion type thing where it's like, it's an interesting juxtaposition with the actual message of Legend of the Galactic Heroes, because Japan went through some major political shifts, obviously going into the 21st century or 20th century, like major shifts,
and even within the
within their government types. But like there's this notion like, oh, everything is as it always has been, but it's kind of an artificial construction. And you look at it, it's like, no, it really isn't in Japan. Like your current government's pretty stable and such, and Japan likes to pretend that we're all so getting along now. Nothing will ever bump the road here. We're all one great community, and it's like well, your politics are extremely regressive, actually, as it turns out. Your court system
is quite denialist.
Yep, your court system is also very regressive, and also it's only been like this for a few decades. Who knows what the future holds? It could go anywhere. It's impossible
to tell.
Well, again,
America faced the same thing as, well, the system's in place. This could never happen here. It's like, we're unique. This could, it's like, it's the exceptionalism concept.
Well, sure, but
it's a folly. And I think that's I think one of the central messages of this series is that it's folly to believe in the permanence of things, that systems will secure things, that, that you can create a perfect system that will maintain itself forever. That somehow you can stave off entropy if you come up with the perfect ideology. Yeah,
and there's also the thing that it raises, that there isn't necessarily a relentless forward march through history either, of like, constant improvement.
Yeah.
Like you can kind of look at like civil rights.
The Dark Ages.
Yeah, civil rights on a global scale has become, generally better. But, that doesn't mean it's going to always continually get better in a forward movement. There's going to be steps back. There's going to be, leaps back, But then you can also look at the standpoint of there's been times in history where things took massive leaps back. Like you can look, pre-Christian times, the ethics of that time are so different from today. Not necessarily in a forwards or backwards thing, but just completely sideways.
Just different.
It's who knows what the future holds with that type of thing, our government, our American government, has gone through a lot of shifts, and that's one of the great lies, is the sense America has been always constant the same thing. It's no, not really. It's constantly inventing itself. The whole, that's why the whole notion of originalism, looking at constitutional type stuff is such a folly. When it's look, so much of our government has been reinvented at this point. You can't go back. There is no going back at this point.
Yeah. Well, society itself.
Society
just our conception of the world fundamentally.
But society, but also just the general structure of America now and America in the 50s is a wholly different beast. And so much of that is, political, but it's also cultural. And, those two things, as it turns out, go very much hand in hand because they feed each other. And where the future goes, who knows?
Yeah. Again, I think the overall lesson that we just keep coming back to is that nothing's permanent. That's kind of it. Entropy rules us all.
Yep.
So, well, I think that's it. I mean, again, I would definitely suggest people check this out themselves. Again, we might have spoiled certain events, but really the conversations it's having, the way things play out throughout are well worth watching. The questions it raises, the answers it finds but also leaves unanswered are important. So it's definitely worth checking out.
I mean, even then,
also it's the internet. Now you can see it without having to pay, $1,000.
Sure.
Yay, free media.
I mean, the other thing with that is the sense, I think the series could have opened up with outright saying hey, Reinhardt and Yang Wenli are going to die. But the thing is everybody dies.
How did we get there? Yeah.
But also everybody dies. The series spans 2 freaking decades. That's not even that surprising in the scope of what it's going on. It's a massive war. Millions of people die during this. It's not so much about them as much as it's about the government and the system around them and what happens in their lives.
Yeah. So it's definitely worth checking out. I mean, I think it's not necessarily my absolute favorite series, but I think it is definitely one that should enter kind of a canon of works that are worth checking out, to experience artistically, philosophically, representative of the potential of the medium in certain ways.
See, what you just need to do is that you need to start watching it a second time and start picking up all the stuff that they have built in that you don't notice the first time around, all the elements that they built in to loop back into itself. It's better the second time around, and then you'll realize why it's so great. Well, you better get started.
Oh, God. Another homework assignment. Well, speaking of homework assignments, next time we will be discussing Nausicaa, Hayao Miyazaki's classic. Got any words on that one?
Just the sense of there's a new Zelda coming out and it's clearly artistically inspired by this, so let's go watch Nausicaa. Why not?
As good an excuse as any.
Look, we're picking these pretty arbitrarily as is. It's why not?
Yeah,
we'll take
yes,
any
but
we
why
can.
not?
It's kind of oh,
well, yes.
We're reading the entrails of sheep here. We're watching the flights of birds. And we've looked at those birds in the sky, and they spelled out, "Just do the Zelda Italian thing." It's all right, that's what you say, birds. I'm with you here, I guess. Let's do this.
Like I said, it's as good an excuse as any.
Yep.
So we will see you guys next time.